Large Israel's national airline just stopped flying, not reduced its schedule, not suspended certain routes, not issued a travel advisory recommending passengers reconsider non-essential travel, stopped every LL flight scheduled between March 21st and March 27th canceled, every aircraft grounded, every crew stood down. The airline that has been the physical connection between the State of Israel and the rest of the world since 1948. The airline that has never stopped flying for any war Israel has ever fought. That flew through the Yom Kippur War, that flew through the Gulf War when Scud missiles were landing in Tel Aviv, that flew through every Inafodata and every Gaza operation and every Lebanon war and every moment of the last 78 years when Israel was under threat and the world was watching to see if the Jewish state would flinch. LL stopped flying, not because of a strike, not because of mechanical failure, not because of a labor dispute or regulatory shutdown, or any of the ordinary categories of airline disruption that aviation authorities manage routinely, because Iran's missiles struck Ben Gurion International Airport, and the damage was sufficient that Israel's national carrier made the calculation that no Israeli airline has made in 78 years of the state's existence. The runways and infrastructure are not safe for commercial operations. The aircraft cannot fly. LL is grounded. Simultaneously, Ben Gurion's management announced a 50% reduction in international flight capacity, not a temporary disruption pending runway inspection. A 50% operational reduction. Half of the international flights that connect 9 million Israelis to the global economy, to their families in the diaspora, to the medical care and business operations and supply chains that a modern nation requires. Canceled indefinitely until the damage is assessed and the security situation permits normal operations to resume. Stay with me, because what Iran striking Ben Gurion Airport and grounding Lal means not just for the specific aircraft and the specific passengers and the specific routes that are no longer flying, but for what it means when the civilian gateway of a nation of 9 million people is struck by an adversary's missiles in a shooting war, and the national airline that has never stopped flying in 78 years decides that this time it has to stop. Is the story that the passenger manifest and the flight cancellation list and the operational disruption notice cannot fully contain. LL stopped flying. Ben Gurion is half closed, and Iran's missiles are the reason. Before we continue, a quick note. Many of the events we cover on this channel follow recurring patterns: economic stress, geopolitical escalation, and systemic shocks. While researching these patterns, I created a detailed report called The Global Crisis Survival Guide, where I break down the warning signals that often appear before major global disruptions and practical strategies for navigating them. If you're interested in reading the full report, you'll find it linked in the description below. Now, let's continue with today's analysis. Let's start with what Ben Gurion Airport actually is, because its description as Israel's main international airport understates what it is in the specific strategic terms that make striking it categorically different from striking any other target in this conflict. Ben Gurion International Airport sits approximately 15 kilometers southeast of Tel Aviv in the city of Lud. It handles approximately 24 million passengers per year in normal operations. The entire population of Israel, plus 15 million additional passengers representing the diaspora connections, the tourism flows, the business travel, and the cargo operations that connect Israel to the global economy. It has 3 terminals. It has 2 primary runways, 826 and 1230, capable of handling every commercial aircraft type and service, including the Boeing 757 and 787 and Airbus A380 that long-haul operations require. Ben Gurion is not just a transportation hub. It is the physical manifestation of Israel's connection to the world, a nation that exists in geographic isolation, surrounded by adversaries, accessible by land through Jordan and Egypt on terms that have been politically managed for decades, depends on its international airport in a way that geographically integrated countries do not depend on theirs. For Israel, Ben Gurion is not one gateway among many. It is the gateway, the single point through which the overwhelming majority of international travel, international commerce, international medical supply, and international human connection flows. Striking Ben Gurion is not striking a military target. It is striking the artery that connects Israel to the circulatory system of the global economy and the global community. And it worked. LAL stopped flying. Half the flights are canceled. The artery is partially severed. Let's talk about the specific strike and what it did to the infrastructure that handles 24 million passengers per year. Iran's missiles struck Ben Gurion in a wave that included the Nasrallah missile, the upgraded multi-warhead Qatar derivative that we covered in the previous video, alongside conventional ballistic missile variants. The strike was not a single impact, multiple impacts across the airport's operational infrastructure, with a targeting precision that reflects the specific intelligence Iran has accumulated about Ben Gurion's layout across 23 days of this conflict and across years of Iranian military planning for exactly this scenario. The damage assessment that Israeli authorities have confirmed publicly is partial. Full damage assessment at an active military scene with ongoing conflict takes time, and the Israeli government has specific operational security reasons to limit what is disclosed about Ben Gurion's current condition. What has been confirmed? Runway damage sufficient to reduce operational capacity. Infrastructure damage to ground support equipment and facilities. An area of the airport perimeter struck with damage extending to the immediate surrounding areas. What has been disclosed through the operational consequences rather than the official statements? LAL grounded for 6 days. International capacity reduced 50%. Multiple international carriers beyond LAL suspending or reducing Israel operations. The physical evidence of what happened at Ben Gurion is visible not in the damage photographs, but in the flight tracking data. The aircraft that are not departing, the routes that are not being served, the 50% of the world's connection to Israel that is currently not flying. Ben Gurion has been struck before, not by missiles, but by the security threat environment that caused airlines to suspend Israeli operations during previous escalations. The difference between airlines voluntarily suspending operations as a precaution and LAL, the airline with the most comprehensive security operation in commercial aviation, being forced to ground its entire fleet because Iran's missiles struck the airport, is the difference between caution and consequence. LL grounds voluntarily when it assesses the risk is too high. L grounded because Iran struck the airport. Those are different sentences. Let's talk about LL specifically and why its grounding is the single most significant symbolic and operational development that Ben Gurion being struck has produced. LL initials stand for LLI's Airlines in Hebrew, but the name means to the skies or upward was founded in 1948, the same year as the State of Israel. It has been operational continuously since its founding. It has never suspended all operations for any security event in its 78-year history. This is not rhetorical. The operational record is specific. During the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a surprise attack that nearly overwhelmed Israeli defenses, and when the existence of the state was genuinely at risk, LAL kept flying. During the Gulf War of 1991, when Scud missiles landed in Tel Aviv and Haifa, and the Israeli civilian population was sitting in sealed rooms with gas masks, LAL kept flying. During the second Intifada, when suicide bombing attacks were killing Israeli civilians on buses and in restaurants and in shopping malls, LL kept flying. During the 2006 Lebanon War, the 2008-2009 Gaza operation, the 2014 Gaza War, the October 7th Hamas attack, and the subsequent Gaza campaign, LAL kept flying. The operational continuity across 78 years of Israeli history, including every major security crisis that history contains, is the specific record that the March 21st through March 27th grounding breaks. LL's decision to ground its fleet for 6 days is not a precautionary measure taken because the security environment is concerning. It is the operational judgment of an airline with the most sophisticated threat assessment capability in commercial aviation that the specific physical infrastructure of Ben Gurion Airport, the runways, the ground support systems, the terminal operations, is not in a condition that permits safe commercial flight operations. That judgment from that airline about that airport is the most consequential single operational assessment of this conflict's impact on Israeli civilian life that any non-governmental institution has produced. LAL stopped flying because it had to, because Iran struck Ben Gurion. let's talk about the strategic logic of striking Ben Gurion and why this target reflects a specific escalation in Iranian targeting doctrine that the previous 23 days had not yet produced. For 23 days, Iran's declared targeting logic has been military assets and American interests. IRGC statements have consistently described the operation as targeting Israeli military infrastructure, air bases, command centers, and American military positions across the region. The civilian dimension of the strikes has been the subject of international humanitarian concern, but Iran has maintained the stated targeting framework of military objectives. Ben Gurion Airport is civilian infrastructure. It is not a military base. It is not an air defense installation. It is not a command center or an intelligence facility, or any of the categories of target that Iran has been describing as legitimate military objectives. It is an international airport that handles civilian passengers, civilian cargo, civilian humanitarian supplies, and civilian economic operations. Striking it is a specific escalation in the category of target that Iran is willing to engage from military infrastructure to civilian infrastructure, from assets that international humanitarian law permits targeting an armed conflict, to assets that international humanitarian law specifically designates as requiring protection for military attack. The strategic logic behind this escalation is the same logic that has driven every previous escalation in this conflict. Each prior escalation was designed to impose a cost that the previous level of targeting could not impose. Military air bases impose a military cost. Ben Gurion imposes an economic cost, a psychological cost, a connectivity cost, and a symbolic cost simultaneously. The economic cost of 50% international flight reduction is immediate and measurable. The psychological cost of LL grounding is symbolic and immeasurable and potentially more significant than any measurable economic damage. Iran targeted Ben Gurion because military targets have been producing military costs for 23 days without producing the political resolution that Iranian strategy requires. Civilian infrastructure produces different costs. Costs that reach the civilian population directly. Costs that the Israeli government must explain to its citizens in terms that military asset losses do not require explanation. You lost a hangar at an airbase. The public never saw it. You lost Lal for 6 days. Every Israeli with a flight booked knows it immediately. Let's talk about the global aviation dimension of Ben Gurion being struck. Because the impact of an Iranian missile attack on a major international airport does not stay within Israel's airspace or Israel's economy. International airlines serving Ben Gurion had already been managing the risk environment of this conflict for 23 days. The calculation each carrier makes is the specific actuarial assessment of operating in a conflict zone, the insurance cost, the crew safety protocols, the passenger demand, the regulatory requirements of their home aviation authorities. Several carriers had already suspended Israeli operations before the Ben Gurion strike as a precautionary measure. The strike confirmed the risk that the precautionary suspensions were designed to manage. After the strike, the carriers that had maintained Israeli operations are reassessing the specific event that airline risk assessment frameworks use to trigger mandatory suspension. A hostile weapon impact on airport infrastructure has occurred. Carriers whose protocols require suspension following a hostile impact are implementing those protocols. The International Aviation Map of Israel, which was already reduced from the normal 80-plus airlines serving Ben Gurion to a significantly smaller number after 23 days of conflict, is contracting further around the Ben Gurion strike's confirmation that the risk is not hypothetical. The cargo dimension is the most immediately consequential for Israeli civilian life. Ben Gurion handles significant cargo alongside passenger operations, medical supplies, pharmaceutical imports, electronic components, agricultural exports, the physical flow of goods between Israel and the global economy that commercial aviation carries. The 50% capacity reduction affects cargo capacity as much as passenger capacity. Medical supply chains that depend on air freight are disrupted. Agricultural exports whose time-sensitive nature makes air freight the only viable option are canceled. The civilian supply dimension of a 50% capacity reduction at Israel's only significant international airport is not visible in the passenger manifest. It is visible in what does not arrive on the shelves and in the hospitals in the days after the strike. Let's talk about what Ben Gurion being struck and LL being grounded means for the Israeli public's perception of this war. Because the psychological dimension of the strike is the specific dimension that the strategic logic was designed to produce. For 23 days, the Israeli public has been living with the specific cognitive structure that allows civilian populations to survive in wartime. The sirens, the shelters, the knowledge that missiles are landing, but that the defensive systems are intercepting most of them, and that the military is conducting the war on Iran's territory rather than on Israeli civilian territory in a meaningful way. The civilian population has been absorbing the war's presence through the architecture of civil defense. The 90 seconds from siren to shelter, the reinforced rooms, the Mag and David Adam casualty figures that are real but manageable while maintaining the functional structure of civilian life. Ben Gurion being struck disrupts that cognitive structure more effectively than any previous Iranian strike has disrupted it. Not because the casualties are higher. 180 people were injured at Diona. The Ben Gurion strike's casualty figures are different, because the disruption is to something that every Israeli interacts with in a way that most Israelis do not interact with military air bases. Every Israeli who had a flight booked through LAL between March 21st and March 27th received a cancellation notice. Every Israeli with a family member abroad who was planning to visit received information that the visit is disrupted. Every Israeli businessman with an international meeting received a travel disruption that affects their economic life directly. Every Israeli who watches the Ben Gurion flight board, the specific public display that shows arrivals and departures, and that the Israeli public treats as a barometer of normally sees the hauled schedule and understands without any analysis what it means. The war is no longer only at the sirens and the shelters and the air defense streaks in the night sky. The war is at the airport that is the most visible single marker of a normal, connected Israeli life. LAL stopped flying. The war reached where everyone can see it. Let's talk about the specific economic consequences that run downstream of 50% international capacity reduction at Ben Gurion and LL's 6-day grounding. Israel's economy was already under maximum stress before Ben Gurion was struck. Tourism, an industry that contributes approximately $20 billion annually to Israeli GDP in normal times, has been effectively zero since February 28th. Foreign direct investment has paused as investors assess the conflict's duration and outcome. The shekel has depreciated 8% against major currencies. Defense spending is consuming the government budget at rates that leave limited fiscal capacity for the civilian economic support, measures that a wartime economy requires. Ben Gurion being struck and LL grounding adds specific quantifiable costs to the existing economic stress. LL's 6-day complete grounding eliminates approximately 1/16 of the airline's monthly revenue. A company that was already operating under the financial strain of 23 days of reduced passenger demand at its main hub. LAL is not a small private carrier. It is Israel's flag carrier and a significant component of Israel's aviation sector. 6 days of complete grounding is a financial event that reaches LL's balance sheet immediately and reaches Israel's aviation sector employment within days if the grounding extends. The cargo disruption is economically significant in ways that are not visible in the passenger cancellation numbers. Israeli technology exports, a sector whose physical shipment requirements include air freight for time-sensitive components, are disrupted. The pharmaceutical supply chain's air freight component is disrupted. The agricultural export window, Israeli produce that requires air freight to reach European markets before spoilage is disrupted. Each disruption produces economic consequences that multiply downstream through the supply chains they interrupt. The 50% capacity reduction is not a 50% economic reduction. It is a 50% reduction in the infrastructure that enables economic activity whose total value is a multiple of the aviation sector's direct revenue contribution. The economic damage runs further and wider than the flight cancellation list suggests. Let's talk about what the international community's response to Ben Gurion being struck means for the diplomatic pressure that is simultaneously trying to produce a ceasefire. The international aviation community has a specific institutional response to airports being struck by hostile weapons in active conflicts. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the United Nations body responsible for international aviation safety, issued an immediate statement condemning the attack on civilian aviation infrastructure and calling for the protection of international airports from military action. The statement invoked the specific provisions of the Chicago Convention, the foundational treaty of international civil aviation that designates civilian airports as protected civilian infrastructure. The AAO statement does something specific to the diplomatic landscape of the ceasefire negotiations. It places the Ben Gurion strike in the category of internationally prohibited attacks on protected civilian infrastructure, and it does so through the institutional voice of the United Nations Aviation Authority. The condemnation is not political. AO is not a political body. It is technical and legal. Iran struck a civilian airport. AO condemned it. The legal record is established. The diplomatic consequence of that legal record is specific. Countries that have been neutral or ambivalent about the conflict's initiation and conduct. Countries in Southeast Asia and Africa and South America, whose airlines serve Ben Gurion and whose passengers use it, now have a direct material interest in the conflict that they did not have before. An Iranian missile striking the airport that their aircraft use and their passengers transit through converts an abstract geopolitical conflict into a specific operational threat to their aviation sector. Ambassadors who were previously managing carefully calibrated positions of concern without commitment are this morning managing the specific question of what their government does when an airport their carriers serve is struck by an adversary's missiles. The diplomatic pressure for ceasefire that was already at its highest level since this conflict began. Omani mediation, 5-day postponement of power plant strikes, Chinese verification framework, Russian Security Council urgency has a new constituency after Ben Gurion. Every government with aviation interests in Israel, every carrier that was still serving Ben Gurion before the strike, every passenger whose flight was canceled, the constituency for ceasefire just expanded by the number of people who had LL tickets for the week of March 21st. Here is what Iran striking Ben Gurion, international airport and grounding law for 6 days means for this war from this morning forward. It means Iranian targeting doctrine has crossed from military infrastructure to civilian infrastructure in the specific form that is most visible to the Israeli civilian population, and most consequential for the Israeli economy's connection to the global system. Ben Gurion is not a military base. Lal is not a military asset. The missiles that struck Ben Gurion were not fired at a target that international humanitarian law permits. They were fired at the airport that connects Israel to the world, and they hit it well enough that the airline with 78 years of uninterrupted service in every previous crisis this nation has faced stopped flying for 6 days. It means the psychological framework that has been allowing Israeli civilian society to maintain functional normally through 23 days of missile exchanges and siren drills and shelter protocols has been struck at its most visible civilian point. The war that has been audible in sirens and visible in night sky intercept streaks is now present in the flight board at the airport, where 24 million people per year arrive and depart. It means the economic damage that was already running through tourism destruction and foreign investment pause and shekel depreciation has a new vector. The 50% capacity reduction that disrupts cargo supply chains, medical supply imports, agricultural export windows, and the business connectivity that a technology-dependent economy like Israel's requires to function at competitive levels. It means AO has placed the Ben Gurion strike in the international legal record as an attack on protected civilian infrastructure, a record that changes the diplomatic positioning of every government with aviation interests in Israel and expands the constituency for ceasefire to include every carrier and every passenger and every cargo shipper whose operational reality was disrupted by an Iranian missile and a 6-day LL grounding. Lal stopped flying. The airline that flew through the Yom Kippur War, the airline that flew through Scud missiles over Tel Aviv, the airline that flew through every crisis in 78 years of Israeli history, stopped for 6 days because Iran's missiles struck Ben Gurion, and the 50% of international flights that are still operating are flying in and out of an airport that Iran has demonstrated it can reach with the missiles that Israeli air defense is 2 to 5 waves from being unable to intercept. The gateway is half closed. The national airline is grounded. The war that 9 million Israelis have been living with, through sirens and shelters and intercept streaks in the sky, just arrived at the place where everyone in Israel goes to leave the country or welcome someone home. And LAL, the airline whose name means upward to the skies, is grounded on the ground for the first time in 78 years because of a missile because Iran hit the airport. And this time, the missiles that got through were enough to stop the airline that has never stopped.